In the home stretch, United States President Donald Trump and Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden hit key swing states in the campaign's final week. Will it be 4 more years of Trump or a new Biden administration? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Almost 70 million Americans have already cast their ballots. Both Biden and Trump are crisscrossing the country in a final push for voters with just a week to go before Election Day. All this happening against the backdrop of a coronavirus surge. We'll get to all of that in just a moment. But first, let's go to our White House correspondent, Nathan King. Nathan, another big story that broke over the past 24 hours, and that is the Senate has confirmed Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. Tuesday's her first day on the job. What kind of impact will her conservative voice have on the bench?
Well, this is huge, and they had a big ceremony here at the White House, as you probably saw on Monday night. This is a true success for President Trump in his first, even if it's his only term. Not just one, but two, but 3 Supreme Court justices, all of them essentially from conservative side of jurisprudence. And, you know, whatever you think of the politics of it in the Senate, the president's job is to nominate a Supreme Court justice. That's what he did. The Senate Republicans may have said, hey, we don't want one in an election year when it was Barack Obama, but they changed their tune pretty quickly and ushered in that confirmation quite incredibly, with discipline, basically only one person backing down from the party, and carried it with a healthy 52 to 48 majority. The controversy of this will live on, but even if the US president departs this White House on January the 20th, 1 term, 3 Supreme Court justices, 6-3 conservative bias now on the Supreme Court. Just quite incredible. And the cases coming before her, from the Affordable Care Act to Obamacare, to potentially even election disputes, to pro-business decisions and beyond, including perhaps the third rail of progressive American politics, and that would be the woman's right to choose, abortion, Roe versus Wade. And she's young. She could be there for decades.
Nathan, I have one more question, and this is a tough one. I hate putting you on the spot, but many polls right now show that the Democratic challenger, Joe Biden, is in the lead in the presidential race, especially in the swing states. So if these polls are to be believed, is this election effectively over? Oh,
thanks, Anand. You know, this is my 6th election. Presidential election. My first one was 2000. So you know how that ended up with the hanging chads in Florida. So I'm not going to put myself out on a limb here. A wise man once told me in Iowa politics, polls are like belly buttons. Everyone has got one. That said, the polls for Joe Biden nationally have been incredibly solid, and a CNBC poll today put him at 51% approval nationally, 40% for the sitting president. That poll has incrementally added to Joe Biden's lead since April. That is a very good harbinger. But as you know, this is not a national election. It's 50 states all voting at the same time. Look at Florida, look at Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Minnesota, Iowa. Where else am I thinking of? Texas even. You know, it really could swing on a couple of states. What we are seeing is Joe Biden is still having narrow leads in the states he needs to win, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, to take back the White House. Also seeing some leads, unlikely, and this is where he was today, in Georgia. And if you look at where they're visiting, you see Trump is going to states he's essentially won and needs to hang on to. The Biden campaign are dipping their toes into Georgia, as I said. Iowa he will go to in the last week. Kamala Harris will go to Texas as well. They think they can expand this map. My one advice, bit of advice to everyone watching this time next week, is go back to the 2000 election. Look at Florida. Why? Well, they count their absentee and mail-in ballots basically before Election Day and on Election Day, so we could get a result very early on in the evening. If the Republicans and Donald Trump lose Florida, it's essentially very difficult for him to win the White House. If Biden does not get Florida, it makes it harder, but not impossible. That, to me, is a huge going to be a huge harbinger. And certain counties as well in Florida, especially around Orlando, will indicate where states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Arizona are going to.
Thanks, Nathan. That's Nathan King there for us at the White House. Thanks a lot. So, well, let's continue now with our discussion and bring in our panel. Dr. Peter Chen-Hong is an infectious disease specialist at the University of California, San Francisco. Joining us from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, Michael Johns is co-founder and leader of the U.S. Tea Party movement. With us here in Washington, Ameshia is a Democratic strategist and political analyst. And also in Washington with us is Seth Berenzweig. Thank you so much. He is an expert on data, privacy, and technology law. Welcome to all of you to the show. Ameshia, let me start with you. You know, as we heard from Nathan just a moment ago, Joe Biden has been campaigning in Georgia, of all places. And we know that Georgia, for the past few election cycles, has been a Republican, staunchly Republican state. Does this tell us that Joe Biden is now so confident of winning those swing states that he's now going into states like Georgia to try and get those states?
Well, it shows us that Joe Biden and the political analysts, as well as the Democratic Party, have been very strategic in acknowledging that there are quakes in the South, places that have been deeply red and conservative for a very long time, like Georgia, whose last Democratic victory was in 91-92. I think that for Joe Biden, being in Georgia speaks to a few things. One, there are 2 Senate races that are up right now that Democrats are leading in, and I think that that is one of the reasons, but also the influence of down ballot races. And just paying attention to the South now, showing that the South is not solidly red. We're seeing states where there are some major competitive places, not only in Georgia, but we see the Senate race in South Carolina. We're seeing what's happening in Arizona. There are several places where this Republican stronghold we've seen for decades just isn't the case anymore. A lot of that's due to demographic shifts. Others are due to the strong pushback that we're seeing that states are having across the country against the Trump administration, particularly how he's handled COVID-19 and how that crisis has not only led to health issues, but also a huge amount of economic divisiveness.
Yeah, I want to talk about that in a moment, but let me go to Michael Johns. Michael Johns, do you think that that solid red wall in the South is beginning to crack?
Well, we'll find out. I think like 2016, polling remains unreliable. It's clear in the Trump era there's a large percentage or a notable percentage of voters who aren't inclined to participate in polling, who will vote for Trump, and those who will even participate and not be straightforward with a pollster. That's one of many reasons there were all these deviations in 2016. There's also concerns about oversampling of Democrats and undersampling of rural Republicans at the expense of suburban Republicans. I think when the American people look at the first 3 years of the Trump presidency, they saw a very vibrant economy, unprecedented in its success in many ways, in job creation and in growth and wages and in unemployment for key demographic groups that hadn't traditionally done well in the prior administration.
Right.
I think they'll also look at coronavirus with an appreciation that as bad as this was, the president did act very expeditiously in the travel ban and trying to get the CDC into China. Of course, China blocked the CDC and the World Health Organization from entering China, which would have been helpful. And I think those issues should be very persuasive. Plus, we have a major scandal over the head of Joe Biden right now. The media is attempting to block it, but the American people are glued into it, and they're very aware that something is very a rift here right now.
Michael, certainly coronavirus is an issue, but there are other issues at play here, which point to the conduct of this administration over the past 3.5 years or 3 3/4 years. This is what Joe Biden said on that visit to Georgia. Let's listen.
President who is not in it for himself, but for others. A president who doesn't divide us, but unites us. A president who appeals not to the worst in us, but to the best. A president who cares less about his TV ratings and more about the American people. A president who looks not to settle scores, but to find solutions. A president guided not by wistful thinking, but by science, reason, and fact. That's the kind of president I hope to be.
So, Michael, Joe Biden clearly having a dig at President Trump there, but listening to those sentiments that he was making there in Georgia. Is that the kind of thing that's going to push voters in his direction, do you think?
No, because the rhetoric doesn't match the reality. The reality is he says he's not in it for himself. In 47 years, he really doesn't have one major accomplishment that he can cite. And now we've got evidence that, many millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions even, have flown into his family. He talks about not being, divisive. He's called voters chumps. He had disparaging words to say to the president, to call the president of the United States in the middle of a debate. He's a highly partisan man who's lived his life through partisan politics. He's a divisive man. Despite his image that he's tried to cultivate as Joe from Scranton, he left Scranton, Pennsylvania, I think 1953, about 70 years ago. He has nothing in common with that. He's been a creature of the swamp. And I think the American people feel that if he had any real solutions to this country, he would have essentially pursued and implemented them by now. Instead, really, aside from the crime bill of the 90s, which locked up a large number of African Americans in this country, not really much to point to in the way of successes.
All right, let me go to Peter Chin-Hong. Peter, Ameshia talked earlier on about the COVID-19 pandemic. If we look at the numbers in the United States, they continue to rise. In fact, if we link this to the politics of what is going on right now, many analysts say that this election is essentially going to be a referendum on how President Trump has handled this pandemic. And we heard some words from his chief of staff, Mark Meadows. It seemed that the administration was giving up, but just let's listen to this.
Here's what we have to do. We're not going to control the pandemic. We are going to control the fact that we get vaccines, therapeutics, and other mitigation.
So, Peter, we hear Mark Meadows telling us that we're not going to control this pandemic. The focus is now going to shift to some kind of mitigation, some kind of cure, vaccines, other kinds of medicines. What do you make of the White House response?
Well, I think it's very limited and myopic. I mean, there have been many countries that have controlled the pandemic, even in extremis. So I think by not aligning with science and not having a national strategy, even something as simple as distribution is really, I think, short-sighted, and I'm worried about it.
What would you like to hear from the administration?
I would like to see a national strategy that unites the states' response. Right now, the hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, and I think California, where I live, can do one thing, but we're at the behest of Nevada, which is right next door, Oregon. So I think, not having a national strategy with porous borders and no intelligent disease screening at the borders amongst the states is really not in the best interest of the folks. Something as simple as a mask mandate, which even Putin has instituted in Russia right now.
All right, let me bring Seth into this conversation. Seth, great to have you on the show. Let's talk about the role of social media in this election. Both Facebook and Twitter have now resorted to deleting or blocking posts that they believe are just merely rumors or not true. In the case of the Hunter Biden emails and that laptop, it's led to accusations that these social media platforms are blocking information that might be harmful to Joe Biden and his campaign. What do you make of the actions they've taken?
Well, I find it a little hard to take the Republicans and the president seriously when they claim that they're the victims of social media, when through the days of Cambridge Analytica, the Russian attacks and so forth that were prevalent in 2016, that actually was part of the context that led to, at least in part, the presidency that we're seeing today. In terms of social media, I think this is really a huge story, and it was just a couple of days ago that we received an evening press conference from the FBI regarding more attacks through social media. The notion that social media continues to get weaponized against American democracy, while the American government continues to be asleep at the wheel, continues to play over and over again like a bad broken record. And it's really incredible to think that there's been virtually no lessons learned as it relates to social media and its impact on the presidential election cycle over the last 4 years. And in fact, the Congress had a big hearing just a couple of weeks ago with the titans of big tech, and all the Democrats were talking about was bashing the companies on top of the head with antitrust violations.
Yeah.
And the Republicans were talking about that they're mad that they're excluding certain conservative thoughts. So it continues to be a huge problem without any kind of a solution from the government.
Yeah. Do you see regulation on the way, Seth?
The only way that I see regulation on the way from Washington is if there's a new administration. It would not be sound to think that the same people are going to suddenly do things differently. And for example, you see the Justice Department suing Google just a couple of days ago for antitrust under a statute that was enacted in the late 1800s. If you have a change in Washington, and if you have a change at the top, then I predict that you will see changes in data privacy, election security, and things of that nature, because it continues to be a very significant problem. And right now, with just days to go before the election, virtually no one in Washington is protecting us.
Ameshia, let's talk about the election and voting that's already taken place. You know, November 3rd is actually not election day, it's the final day of voting. People have been voting for weeks right now, some for more than a month in some places. We know now, the latest figures we have is that almost 70 million people have already voted. What do you read into that?
Well, the diagnostics show that 80 million by this weekend in America will have voted. My read on that from what we've seen thus far is that we have a lot of new voters, those who were previously not registered. This was their first time voting in an election. We have an outsourced number of younger voters, people that under 35, under 30 crowd that is always one that campaigns want to get, but they never really show up to the polls. They're actually there now. We're seeing record numbers of minority voters, both Black, Latino, and otherwise. I think that there is a sense of urgency. The Biden campaign's push of fighting for the soul of America has really gotten into the veins of a lot of people here. And folks who might have been on the fence beforehand have seen how President Trump handled COVID-19, are going through unemployment right now, are waiting on the government to work out some type of, or were waiting on the government to work out some type of, some more checks to them to help them to stay afloat. And we saw that instead of doing that, the Republicans and the president prioritized pushing Amy Coney Barrett. And I think that there's a level of frustration among the American public, specifically minorities, who also watched the president push back hard against taking down white supremacy and calling it out. And they just feel as though their hands are tied, and the only way that they can make any bit of change is to rush to the polls. We see that in the numbers.
All right, let me get Michael John's view on that. Michael, you know, we've seen up to 70 million people have already voted in this election. Analysts are telling us that there will be a lot more Republicans voting actually on election day. They will come out on election day and vote. I mean, that's an unknown at this stage. But if there is a big turnout of Republican voters on November 3rd, do you think it's going to be enough to tip the balance back in Donald Trump's favor?
Yeah, I think if you're formally affiliated with the campaign, you're going to inevitably say, hey, things look great, or, the other side looks bad. I think the reality is, we're going to see what happens here. I think Republicans are more inclined to come out. They're not big believers in the reliability of mail-in ballots. I think anecdotally, the cases that have emerged over the last several months suggest that there's good reason for that, including, entire cities like in New Jersey who've had to redo their elections because of major levels of voter fraud. So those are legitimate concerns. I also think you're seeing clearly a major distinction in the magnitude of enthusiasm across this country and in the amount of energy. I mean, if this were a job interview, you wouldn't say that Joe Biden's really showing up with a lot of energy or excitement. Can't motivate a crowd, can't attract a crowd. Trump's, in 4 states in a day as of this last weekend, 3 cities in Pennsylvania yesterday, additional states today. I think it's pretty clear he wants it more. I think his vision is better. And for all the criticism on the pandemic, it's very vague. They're not really able in Biden to point to anything that they would have done differently. In fact, Biden opposed the travel ban that Trump implemented on January 31 that was arguably the single most important decision and the most controllable decision in the management of the pandemic.
Peter, with the White House now saying that, look, we know that we cannot control this pandemic any longer, is there any more federal help coming? Because the numbers continue to rise.
I think Trump has really delegated much of the control of the pandemic to the state level, which is really anti what we think should happen from a medical and scientific point of view. simply because the virus doesn't know any borders, doesn't know any, doesn't know any difference in SES or anything like that. In terms of aid, I think, the economic repercussions of the pandemic has really decimated a lot of communities. And, I know that California, for example, had asked for more aid and were sort of blocked in some senses. So I think, from that perspective, it's been very difficult. From the medical perspective, I think we're worried about, not having enough drug once the twindemic of influenza and COVID come along later in the winter. It's looking bad, but I think it's going to look even worse in a few months.
Peter, we heard from a think tank here in Washington, a think tank called the Center for American Progress. It supports Democrats, and it says that a number of the COVID infections that we've seen in recent weeks can be, the increase in the number that is, can be attributed to rallies that the president has held. Is there any credence to that?
Well, certainly if you bring a lot of unmasked folks together, it's not rocket science to think that the virus is going to jump from somebody's nose or mouth to another nose or mouth. We do know that congregate settings do facilitate the wildfire spread of virus. So it's not, surprising that these rallies would bring together a lot of virus transmission. We've seen that in a very dramatic sense in Strategist in the Dakotas. So I think that was really the nidus for what's happening in the Dakotas right now. And, to suppress sort of contact tracing around the Rose Garden event, that's all, being, eyes are masked as the extent of this problem.
Michael, the president has been talking about what he's been doing about the pandemic. This is what he said. Let's listen to it.
Voters are judging me on a lot of things, and one of the things we've done a really good job on is COVID. We would have millions of people, millions right now. We would have millions of people. Yeah, 2 million people. They were projecting 2.2 if we didn't do what we did.
Michael, the president says he's done a really good job, but the polls don't tell us that. 2/3 of people who were polled, and in some instances up to 3/4, tell us that the president has messed it up. He's bungled this.
Well, I mean, no one can be satisfied with the economic ramifications, the public health ramifications, the magnitude of it. A lot of popularity for the support for China has diminished as well, as China's been implicated as the origin of this, which has been a big factor.
Yeah.
I think the president really, I don't think you can attribute a single death to the federal government inaction. They went into action right away with, almost every component of this: mobilization of health resources, vaccine that's going to be developed in record speed. Vaccines, having worked in the health and care industry, I can tell you, take a decade to develop. We're going to get one in 1.5 years. Therapeutics, encouraging. Our testing system is the best in the world.
Yeah, Michael, we did.
Masks,
Michael, we did have a report
from masks.
Yeah, Michael, we did have a report from Columbia University just a few days ago telling us that if the government had done a better job, if this administration had done a better job at the beginning, about 130,000 deaths could have been avoided.
Yeah, well, about half of those are in New York City, where Columbia University is, and there were big mistakes made by Cuomo and Governor Cuomo, Democrat from New York, in allowing patients to be admitted, encouraging them to be admitted into non-infected facilities. So the governors have managed it with different levels of capability. On the masks, look, if you're condemning Trump rallies, you better be out condemning street riots and protests. If you're not, it's political messaging, and sadly, we've had too much of that.
All right. All right, let me go to Seth. Seth, I want to talk about a story that Michael mentioned earlier on in the show, and that is the Hunter Biden story. That story seems to have got some traction on social media, but there was a Republican senator, a very prominent senator, Ted Cruz, who said in an interview with the political multimedia site Axios, he said that in his view, the Hunter Biden story didn't not have any impact on voters at all. He said it didn't move a single voter. Do you think that is the case?
Well, I don't know how in the world he would have any basis to have any clue whether that's true or not. I think social media has a very persistent and consistent impact and could certainly affect voters. And one of the things that's so unfortunate about that situation, and I know that this Hunter Biden laptop thing has come up during the panel's discussion tonight. It's interesting that that was first delivered by Rudy Giuliani to Fox News. Fox wouldn't take it. When the New York Post published it, the person that wrote it at the New York Post wouldn't put his name on it. Two other people on the floor refused to put their name on it, and then it was only after it was flooded through that social media channel that it was just pumped out before the final presidential debate. Listen, I have a lot of respect for opinions and people on both sides, and I really can't come to a definitive conclusion other than to say that it is highly suspect, and it continues to demonstrate that social media is having a major impact. And if the Senate, if the United States Senate turns Democratic as a result of this election, you will probably see new election security and data security technology laws that are becoming out of Washington, and we really do need that, especially from what you've seen over the past several weeks.
All right, Ameshia, what are your thoughts on what social media is doing right now in respect of this election?
Well, I think that social media is one of the fastest ways to transmit information. Sadly, social media is not the best form of deciphering whether that information is true, whether it's from valid sources, or whether or not it should actually even be taken into consideration. I think the Hunter Biden story is a very good use of that. Major media didn't pay it any attention because it lacked real legitimate sources and it lacked reliability. What we know about social media is that it's very easy to infiltrate. We know that it's been infiltrated by foreign governments who have been trying to get involved in American elections for a long time, that they're doing it again this go round. I think that, you know, the majority of the American public is smart enough to actually pay attention to the candidates and their policies and what they're doing on the ground. But I can't say that you know, social media channels thus far have done enough to be able to restrain some of the craziness we're seeing flow through those channels.
Right, Peter, I've only got a minute left, but there is some light at the end of the tunnel. We heard some good news this week about a vaccine. We heard it from Oxford University and its commercial partner AstraZeneca, saying that they have an experimental vaccine that they're working on which produces an immune response, not just in older people, but in younger people as well. How significant is this?
Well, I think that the vaccine is great news, and I always, have followed Oxford and AstraZeneca for a while, and believe in it. But the vaccine is no magic bullet. I think the vaccine is going to take a while to roll out to all segments of the population, and it's just one strategy. I think we are still going to need to do everything else until we get everyone immunized. And if 50% of Americans don't want to get immunized or they're afraid of it, then it may be not the magic bullet that we all wanted or hoped for.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu. Thanks for watching.